Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about taking research notes. Now, there's a lot of different ways to take research notes, and I'm going to go through a few of them that I find most useful or that I've heard other people talk about being useful for them. Basically, the point of research notes is to help you organize all of the material that you gather as you're doing research for a scholarly essay, article, book, chapter, book, whatever it is, any sort of scholarly project where you're going to be drawing on a lot of different sources. You want to be able to make sure you remember what material you're getting from what source and how you want to incorporate all of that together. So a couple of different techniques I'm going to talk about. One is I'll mention annotated bibliographies, but I've done a video on annotated bibliographies before, so I'm not gonna talk too much about those. But I'll talk about sort of my system, which is a very direct sort of recording of what page and what information I want to use out of different texts. I'll talk a little bit about annotating texts themselves, although I think I've done a video on annotations before as well. I'll talk about a couple of different approaches to things called a triple entry notebook, different ways of sort of making charts with information, and I'll show you a couple of those things as well. So first, one approach that a lot of people find really, really useful for keeping research notes is the annotated bibliography. Basically, an annotated bibliography, I typically explain it as a modified works cited page, right? You have a works cited entry, MLA, APA, Chicago style, whatever it is, a bibliographic citation. So you can keep that information easily accessible for you. That's one of the big advantages of the annotated bibliography, is that you have that citation right there, so that when you go to create your works cited page or your references page or whatever it is for the document that you're ultimately going to be writing, you have that information accessible. So that's really, really handy. But then underneath each of those citations on the annotated bibliography, you explain what that source is about. So typically when I have my students do an annotated bibliography, I have them do a fairly short one usually, and that includes a 1 to 2 sentence summary of the main argument the source is making, identifying some key points, identifying strengths and weaknesses, and then considering briefly how that source might be useful for the argument that you're making in the overall project. So that's the kind of things that typically go into an annotated bibliography, and they can be more or less detailed. So this is a really, really good way of identifying for yourself the key components of what's important in a particular document. The other thing that you can do with an annotated bibliography for a specific project is identify connections or disagreements between sources. So that'll help you figure out how things are in conversation with one another. So that's one strategy a lot of people use. What I do with my research is for big projects, particularly my book length projects and things like that, chapters of books, things like that, I tend to keep research notebooks. And so this one is on books about theater and culture, books or articles about theater and culture. So these are broad topics. Like for the book project I'm working on right now, I have a research notebook on theater and culture. I have one on democracy, globalization, and politics, I think. And then I have one on adaptation, which are the three sort of big categories that sort of converge for the book project I'm doing. And then what I do is at the top, I put yellow sticky notes with generally just the last name of the author, but if it's an author that I'm working with more than one of their books or articles or whatever it is, I'll also put a title keyword so I can remember which piece it is. That works really well for me. I also have access continually to these books and articles and things, so I can come back to these things and make up my citations as I'm doing it. But again, it may be worthwhile to just record that citation information the first time you're working with the source. But then basically what I do is, in the margin here, I'll list the page number the relevant piece of information comes from, and then a brief description of that information, a brief description of what's important on that page. So, for instance, this book by Osman, it's about Egyptian history. And on page 33, he talks about the 1923 Constitution, which enshrined a kind of democracy. So that was the important piece of information for me. So that's what I wrote down. 1923 Constitution enshrines semi-democracy. I put semi in parentheses. Not important, but that's the way that I tend to take my notes. And then what those correspond to is notations in the actual text itself. Obviously, if you're working from library books, don't write your notes in them. But if you own the book, I do suggest using annotations in the book because it will help you keep track of your information. And there's a ton of different ways of doing this. Everybody makes up their own sort of system for annotating, for notating, for reminding themselves of what's important. I like to use a lot of brackets and things. So I tend to bracket the broad sections that I'm interested in and then put more specific quotes or sections I'm really interested in parentheses. And then I'll often also put comments in the margins. Actually, as I've read more and more stuff, and as I've sort of started accumulating huge bodies of research that I can pre-draw on, one of the things that I've really started doing is just summing up what's important. So it may actually be the same entry that's in my research notebook that gets put in the margin of the book itself, but just something there to remind myself of why I thought this particular section was important or what I intended to get out of that. I find that really, really helpful in terms of keeping track of, especially when I've got a large number of sources that I'm looking at. I find that really, really helpful in terms of keeping track of what I'm doing. So next, I want to share my screen with you because I want to talk about a couple of different approaches to what are sometimes called triple entry notebooks. And there's a lot of variations of this as well. Hopefully you can see this on the screen here. So this is one form of a triple entry notebook. And basically what that does is it's a system for keeping research notes in one document. One approach is the one that I've used here, which is where you have a column that identifies the particular source. So I've just put the title and the author, or in the case of racial microaggressions and daily well-being among Asian Americans, I put the primary author et al. Because there's like half a dozen authors. You could, again, list out a full bibliographic citation, a full works cited citation, and that's a really useful thing to have access to. The next thing that I've done here is key points. And for the purposes of this video, I've just listed one key point. But there's a couple of ways you can approach the key points thing. What I've done here is quotations from the text. That's a useful thing to have because then actually you can copy paste your quotations, make sure you write them out correctly, obviously, but you can copy paste your quotations into the actual essay or chapter or book or whatever it is that you're writing, and you have that information right there, along with the page number. Obviously, you want the page number included. Another approach you can take to this is just paraphrasing or summing up key arguments. So you just say, for racial microaggressions, for instance, you could have a bullet point that just sort of said, Asian Americans most typically experience micro-invalidations. That's one of the arguments that the authors make in this. That's not a direct sentence from them, but you can put that as sort of the key information that you need to remember about the argument that they're making. And then this third column is really where you can get a lot of variation with this type of recording system. So what I've done is my thoughts or reactions. So these are things that occurred to me, things that either connections that I've made or concerns about the way that data was gathered, potential limitations that I want to keep in mind in order to make sure that if I were writing something about these sources, I could assess how trustworthy or not trustworthy they are, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one approach, is my thoughts or reactions. Another thing that you can put in this column that's pretty common is something like connections or disagreements. That can actually get a little bit more complicated depending on how many sources you're using. If you're using more than maybe half a dozen sources, this can get somewhat tricky because you would just have connections and points of disagreement between a ton of different sources. And so that may get difficult for you to follow as a reader. You to follow as a researcher, maybe is a better way of putting it. But you can put my thoughts and reactions. Another thing that you can do in this third column here that makes a lot of sense is, how would I use this information? What can I make meaning of for this, for my argument? So that's slightly different than the key points, because the key points is information about that document itself, what that essay says. How can I use this is, where does this fit into my argument? So as my argument is evolving, as I'm figuring out what I want to say, what would I want? What would I want with this particular source? And that's a really useful way of, again, just sort of planning what you're going to say, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm going to try and switch screens again. Okay, so this is another, in this case, quadruple entry notebook, I suppose. This is another chart type method for taking research notes. This one is broken down in a bit more detail, particularly useful for things in the sciences, either the social sciences or STEM. So the same thing we had before. First column is going to be, what is this source? Second column, in this case, is research methods or research questions. Third column is methodology. Fourth column is findings. So again, for the sciences, for an article that works according to the structure of a sciences article, this is going to make a lot of sense because, as I talk about in my video on the structure of science articles, social sciences and STEM, this is the way that these articles are set up. You have a research question or hypothesis presented at the beginning. You have a methodology section, you have a findings section, you have discussion, et cetera, et cetera. So breaking up your research on the social sciences or STEM or anything like this, according to this system, where it's sort of mirroring the key pieces of information that we get from scientific articles, that makes a lot of sense. So that's a good way of doing things as well, if you're working in the sciences. If you're working in the arts or humanities or something like this, it may not make as much sense to use this type of system because methods and findings are not necessarily as distinct a component, but you could still go for research question or thesis or something like that and work from there. So that's several different approaches to keeping research notes. Again, this is a crucial thing. You want to be keeping notes as you're doing your research so that you can keep track of what you're finding and start identifying what's going to be important for your argument, start identifying connections and differences between sources, et cetera, and just make everything as easy for yourself as possible as you're going forward. Again, there's a lot of different approaches. These are basic models for these types of research notes. You want to figure out what's going to work for you.